The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet, affluent street, casting long, menacing shadows. Officer Peterson thought he had caught a common thief lurking in the prestigious Oak Ridge estates. He slapped the cuffs on the older black man in the faded sweatshirt, completely ignoring the calm, steady voice demanding a supervisor. Peterson smirked, absolutely certain of his authority. He had no idea the wrists he had just bound belonged to a decorated 2-star general, and the United States military was already on its way. The early morning air in Oak Ridge Estates was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and freshly cut lawns. It was a neighborhood of sprawling properties, manicured hedges, and silent security cameras. Major General David Henderson, a man who had commanded thousands of troops across multiple combat deployments, was enjoying a rare weekend of absolute quiet. Having recently been transferred to the nearby military installation to oversee a major strategic command reorganization, David had just purchased a stunning 4-bedroom home on Elmwood Drive. At 58, he kept himself in immaculate physical condition. This morning, he was dressed in well-worn, faded grey sweatpants, a plain black hooded sweatshirt, and a pair of scuffed running shoes. There were no stars on his collar, no ribbons on his chest, just a man taking a brisk morning walk to clear his head before a grueling week of briefings. He paused near the edge of his property line, crouching down to stretch his calves against the stone retaining wall. In his left ear, a wireless earbud connected him to an ongoing, muted conference call with his Chief of Staff, Colonel Robert Davis, who was running through the morning's intelligence read ahead. 2 blocks down, a local municipal police cruiser was rolling slowly through the neighborhood. Behind the wheel sat Officer Bradley Peterson. Peterson was a 6-year veteran of the force, with a reputation that preceded him, a record sprinkled with excessive force complaints and racial profiling allegations that the Union had always managed to quietly sweep under the rug. In the passenger seat sat Officer Kyle Jenkins, a rookie barely 6 months out of the academy, still idealistic and painfully eager to please his senior partner. Peterson tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the immaculate driveways. There had been a string of minor package thefts in the neighboring subdivision, and Peterson was already on edge, eager to make a collar. When his eyes landed on the figure in the faded black hoodie, crouching by the stone wall, his posture stiffened. "Look at this guy," Peterson muttered, slowing the cruiser to a crawl. Jenkins looked up from the dispatch terminal. "Looks like someone jogging, Brad." "Nobody jogs in a hoodie that beat up around here, kid. This is a gated-style community. Homes start at 2 million. Peterson's jaw set into a hard line. "He's casing the houses, checking the sight lines." "He's just stretching," Jenkins said, his voice hesitant. "We don't have a description of the porch pirate." "I don't need a description," Peterson snapped, hitting the accelerator and swerving the heavy cruiser abruptly toward the curb. "I know what doesn't belong." The screech of the tires breaking the morning silence made David turn his head. He watched with mild curiosity as the police vehicle threw itself into park aggressively, blocking the sidewalk just inches from where he stood. The overhead lights weren't flashing yet, but the intent was clear. Peterson stepped out of the vehicle, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his service weapon. "Hey, you! Keep your hands where I can see them!" David stood up slowly to his full height of 6'2". His military posture was undeniable, his shoulders squared automatically, his spine perfectly straight. He did not raise his hands in a panic, nor did he shrink back. He simply looked at Peterson with the calm, analytical gaze of a man accustomed to assessing threats in active war zones. "Good morning, officer," David said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried natural authority. "Is there a problem?" "I'm asking the questions here," Peterson barked, stepping into David's personal space. The officer was shorter, but he tried to compensate by jutting out his chest. What are you doing in this neighborhood? I am stretching my legs, David replied calmly. Through his earbud he could hear Colonel Davies pause his briefing. David tapped the earbud once, a signal for Davies to stay on the line and listen. Stretching your legs, Peterson repeated, a sneer curling his lip. Do you live around here? I do. What's the address? David pointed a single finger at the massive, modern colonial home directly behind him. Right there. Number 42. Peterson laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Right, you live in the Miller house, the one that just sold for $2.5 million. I am not familiar with the previous owners, but yes, I recently purchased this property, David said. His tone remained perfectly level, though his eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized the tone. He recognized the posture. He had dealt with men like Peterson his entire life, long before the stars adorned his uniform. Let's see some ID, Peterson demanded. For standing on my own property? David asked, his voice cooling by several degrees. Unless I am suspected of committing a crime, officer, I am under no legal obligation to provide identification simply because you demand it. You match the description of a suspect involved in multiple burglaries in this area, Peterson lied effortlessly, closing the distance. Now give me your ID, or I'm going to detain you. Jenkins had stepped out of the passenger side, lingering near the trunk of the cruiser. Brad, maybe we should just— Shut up, Jenkins, Peterson snapped without looking back. He turned his attention back to David. Last chance, buddy. ID. Now. Officer, David said, his voice dropping into a register of pure command. You are currently operating on false premises. I suggest you take a step back, run the plates of the vehicles in that driveway, and rethink your approach. The absolute lack of fear in the black man's voice infuriated Peterson. To him, the calmness was defiance. The articulate speech was disrespect. All right, that's it. Put your hands behind your back. Peterson lunged forward, grabbing David's left wrist aggressively. David's combat instincts flared. Every muscle in his body tightened, and for a fraction of a second, his weight shifted. He could have broken Peterson's grip, disarmed him, and had the officer on the ground in under 3 seconds. But David's brilliant tactical mind ran the algorithm of the situation perfectly. He was a black man in a hoodie facing an angry, prejudiced cop with a gun. If he fought back, he would be shot. If he complied, he would win the war later. David immediately relaxed his arm, allowing Peterson to twist it behind his back with unnecessary force. I am complying, David said loudly and clearly, ensuring Colonel Davies was catching every word on the open line. I am not resisting. You are making an unlawful arrest on my private property. Save it for the judge, Peterson grunted, slamming the heavy steel handcuffs onto David's wrists. Peterson shoved David roughly against the side of the police cruiser, the cold metal biting into the general's cheek. Jenkins flinched, taking a half step forward. Brad, take it easy. He's not fighting you, Jenkins warned, looking nervously up and down the street. A few early rising neighbors were beginning to peer out of their front windows. He was resisting, Peterson lied, patting David down with rough, invasive movements. Spread your legs. Peterson kicked the inside of David's ankles. David remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. He focused his breathing, drawing air in through his nose and out through his mouth, maintaining the legendary composure that had earned him the Silver Star in Fallujah. Let him hang himself, David thought. Let him dig the hole so deep he can never climb out. Peterson reached into the front pocket of David's sweatpants and pulled out a slim, black leather card holder. Let's see who you really are, the officer muttered triumphantly. He flipped the wallet open. Inside was David's North Carolina driver's license, a black American Express card, and his Department of Defense Common Access card, CAC. Peterson pulled out the driver's license, shining his flashlight on it despite the rising sun. "David Henderson, Charlotte address. I knew you didn't live here." "I told you I just moved in," David said steadily, his face still pressed against the cruiser. "The address hasn't been updated yet. If you look behind the license, you will find my primary identification." Peterson snorted, pulling out the military ID. He glanced at it, but his bias had already drawn a permanent filter over his eyes. He saw the photo of the black man. He saw the complex barcode and the smart chip, but his brain completely refused to process the words Major General or the clear, distinct rank insignia printed on the card. "What is this? Some kind of fake contractor badge?" Peterson scoffed, tossing the military ID back into the wallet. "You think buying a fake badge online gets you a free pass to prowl around rich neighborhoods?" Jenkins stepped closer, his eyes catching a glimpse of the card, before Peterson shoved the wallet into his own uniform pocket. "Wait, Brad. Let me see that card for a second. That looked like a DOD. "It's a fake, Kyle! Stop questioning me!" Peterson yelled, grabbing David by the shoulder and spinning him around. "Get in the car." Peterson opened the back door of the cruiser and forcefully pushed David down into the hard plastic seat, deliberately pressing down on the older man's neck to ensure his head bumped against the doorframe. David absorbed the impact silently, sliding into the suffocating stale air of the back seat. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud, locking from the outside. Inside the cruiser, it was rapidly heating up as the morning sun hit the windows. David sat completely still. His earbud had been knocked loose during the struggle, but had fallen into the hood of his sweatshirt, completely unnoticed by Peterson. Faintly, vibrating against his collarbone, he could hear the frantic voice of Colonel Davies. General Henderson. Sir, are you there? I have the Provost Marshal on the line. I have base security rolling out. General, do you copy?" David couldn't reach the earbud, but he spoke clearly enough for the microphone to pick it up. "I am secure. Track my phone's GPS. Inform Lieutenant General Caldwell." Outside the car, Peterson was leaning against the trunk, writing furiously on his notepad. Jenkins was pacing nervously, his gut churning with a terrible intuition. "Brad, I'm telling you, we need to run that ID through the terminal," Jenkins pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "If that guy is who I think he is, he's a nobody, Jenkins. He's a thug who wandered into the wrong zip code," Peterson growled, pointing a pen at the rookie's chest. "I'm tired of these people coming out to the suburbs thinking they can take whatever they want. I'm charging him with prowling, resisting arrest, and providing false identification." "He didn't resist," Jenkins argued back, finally finding a shred of spine. "And he's standing in front of the house. What if he actually lives there? Then he can prove it to the magistrate," Peterson sneered. He walked around to the driver's side and climbed in, firing up the engine. Jenkins reluctantly climbed into the passenger seat, staring through the thick plexiglass partition at the man sitting quietly in the back. David met Jenkins's eyes through the rear-view mirror. The general's gaze was not angry. It was cold, calculating, and terrifyingly calm. It was the look of an apex predator patiently waiting for the trap to spring. Jenkins felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "Officer Peterson," David said, through the grated partition, his voice cutting through the hum of the cruiser's AC. "I am formally requesting that you contact your watch commander. Furthermore, I advise you to read the military identification card you confiscated from me. You have exactly one opportunity to correct this before it leaves your hands." Peterson let out a harsh bark of laughter, shifting the car into drive. "You watch too many movies, old man. You don't give orders back there. You sit down, shut up, and enjoy the ride to county." "Very well," David replied softly, leaning back into the hard plastic. "You were warned." As Peterson pulled the cruiser away from the curb, he reached for his radio to call in the transport. He had no idea that 10 miles away, the massive steel gates of the military installation had just swung open. 3 black, armored Chevrolet Suburbans, flanked by 2 heavily armed military police cruisers, were already tearing down the highway, sirens wailing and lights flashing, tearing through the morning commute. Lieutenant General Richard Caldwell, the base commander and David's immediate superior, was sitting in the lead vehicle. Caldwell was a man who did not tolerate mistakes, and he absolutely did not tolerate local law enforcement putting their hands on his commanding officers. "I want that police cruiser intercepted before it reaches the precinct," Caldwell barked into his encrypted radio, his face flushed with fury. "And I want the badge numbers of the officers involved. They just declared war on the wrong man." The interior of the police cruiser was thick with a suffocating, hostile silence. In the back seat, Major General David Henderson sat completely still, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, the metal biting into his wrists with every bump in the road. He focused on the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt, letting his military training govern his physiological responses. His heart rate was a steady, calm 60 beats per minute. He did not speak. He did not complain. He simply waited. In the front passenger seat, Officer Kyle Jenkins was rapidly losing his battle with anxiety. The rookie's stomach churned violently. He could not shake the memory of the cold, authoritative gaze the man in the back had directed at him. That was not the look of a frightened burglar or a seasoned street criminal. That was a look of absolute, unwavering command. Jenkins discreetly pulled his smartphone from his tactical vest, shielding the screen from Peterson's peripheral vision. With a trembling thumb, Jenkins opened his web browser and typed the name he had briefly seen on the confiscated driver's license, David Henderson. He added the keywords military and North Carolina. The search results populated instantly, and all the blood drained from Jenkins's face. The top result was a Department of Defense press release from just 3 weeks ago. There was a high-resolution photograph of the man currently sitting in the back of their cruiser. In the photo, however, David was not wearing a faded hoodie. He was dressed in a pristine Army service uniform, his chest covered in a colorful wall of ribbons, including the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star. On his shoulders sat the heavy silver insignias of a 2-star Major General. The headline read, "Major General David Henderson takes command of Joint Strategic Operations Center at Regional Base." Jenkins felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly devoid of saliva. He looked over at his training officer. Peterson was casually chewing a piece of gum, one hand resting lazily on the steering wheel, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just committed an act of monumental professional suicide. "Brad," Jenkins whispered, his voice cracking. "Brad, pull the car over." "What?" Peterson scoffed, not taking his eyes off the road. "We're 5 minutes from the precinct, kid. Hold your bladder." "No, Brad. Listen to me right now," Jenkins pleaded, turning his body fully toward the senior officer. He shoved the smartphone directly into Peterson's line of sight. "Look at this picture. Look at it. The guy in the back. He's not a prowler. He's a 2-star general. He's the new commander of the base up the highway." Peterson aggressively swatted the phone away, his face turning red with sudden anger. "Are you out of your mind? You believe everything you see on the internet? That's a coincidence. Or he stole the guy's identity. I'm telling you, the ID in his wallet was fake. It felt cheap. Now put your damn phone away before I write you up for insubordination. He told you he lived at the $2 million house, Brad. The press release says he just transferred here. The ID wasn't fake. You just didn't read it." Jenkins was almost shouting now, true panic setting in. "We need to uncuff him and apologize right now. We are kidnapping a federal officer." "Shut your mouth, Jenkins," Peterson roared, his grip tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. I am the senior officer. I make the calls. This thug is going into a holding cell, and if you say one more word, I'll make sure you're riding a desk for the rest of your miserable short career." Before Jenkins could respond, the radio mounted on the dashboard crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice sounded tense, carrying an edge of urgency that neither officer had ever heard before. "Unit 4, Bravo. Dispatch. Come in, 4 Bravo." Peterson snatched the radio mic. "This is 4 Bravo. Go ahead." 4 Bravo. Pull over immediately and secure your location. Advise your coordinates. We are receiving emergency communications from the Department of Defense. They are tracking your vehicle." Peterson froze, the microphone hovering near his lips. "Repeat, dispatch. DOD is tracking us? For what?" "They state you have unlawfully detained a high-ranking military official. The base commander is en route to your location with a heavily armed detail. Do not proceed to the precinct. I repeat, do not proceed. Pull over immediately." A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the front seat. Jenkins stared at Peterson, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "I told you," Jenkins whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I told you." Peterson's arrogant facade finally began to crack, replaced by a desperate, stubborn denial. No, it's a trick. He's got somebody on the outside making fake calls. I'm not pulling over. We're going to the station to sort this out." He pressed his foot harder on the accelerator. But as they crested the hill on Miller Highway, the decision was made for them. Approaching from the opposite direction at terrifying speed was a convoy of 3 massive, matte black armored Chevrolet Suburbans, flanked by 2 military police cruisers with their blue and red tactical lights blindingly bright. The wail of the heavy military sirens drowned out everything else. "Holy!" Peterson muttered, his eyes widening in shock. The lead Suburban didn't slow down to pass. Instead, it aggressively swerved across the double yellow line, hurtling directly into the path of the police cruiser. Peterson slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the pavement as the heavy police interceptor skidded to a violent halt. Instantly, the 2 military police cruisers whipped around the sides, blocking Peterson's vehicle from the rear. The remaining Suburbans angled themselves perfectly to box the local police cruiser in completely. There was nowhere to go. Before the dust had even settled, the doors of the military vehicles flew open. Over a dozen heavily armed military police officers poured out into the street. They were dressed in full tactical gear, Kevlar vests, ballistic helmets, and carrying M4 carbines that they held at the low ready. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, instantly establishing a hardened perimeter around the trapped police cruiser. Peterson sat frozen behind the wheel, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The flashing lights painted his pale, terrified face in alternating shades of red and blue. "Hands where we can see them! Both hands on the dashboard! Now!" roared a burly military police sergeant, aiming his weapon directly at the windshield of the police cruiser. Jenkins instantly slammed both of his hands against the glass, practically hyperventilating. Peterson, shaking uncontrollably, slowly raised his hands to the steering wheel. The predator had suddenly, violently, become the prey. The air outside the police cruiser vibrated with the low, menacing hum of the armored Suburban's massive engines. The military police had completely locked down the 4-lane highway, stopping civilian traffic a quarter-mile in both directions. Officer Peterson sat paralyzed behind the wheel, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. From the rear door of the lead Suburban stepped Lieutenant General Richard Caldwell. Caldwell was a towering figure with a chiseled jaw, piercing grey eyes, and an aura of absolute authority that commanded immediate compliance. He wore his utility camouflage uniform, the 3 black stars pinned to his chest gleaming under the morning sun. He did not run. He marched toward the police cruiser with slow, deliberate, heavy steps, like an executioner approaching the block. Flanked by 2 armed MPs, Caldwell stopped inches from Peterson's driver's side window. He did not tap on the glass. He simply stared down at the trembling local cop until Peterson fumbled with the controls and rolled the window down. "I am Lieutenant General Richard Caldwell, commander of the Joint Strategic Operations Center." Caldwell's voice was dangerously quiet, a stark contrast to the shouting of his MPs. "Step out of the vehicle, slowly. Keep your hands away from your duty weapon." Peterson's voice trembled as he tried to summon a shred of his former bravado. "General, sir, I am operating under local municipal jurisdiction. You have no legal authority to— Step out of the vehicle before my men forcibly extract you through the windshield, officer," Caldwell interrupted, his tone laced with venom. Jenkins, sitting in the passenger seat, didn't wait for permission. He threw his door open, shoved his hands high into the air, and practically fell out onto the pavement. "Don't shoot! Please, I told him! I tried to tell him!" Jenkins cried out, backing away from the vehicle with his hands raised. Peterson, realizing he was entirely outmatched and utterly alone, slowly opened his door and stepped out onto the highway. The moment his boots touched the asphalt, 2 military police officers stepped forward, forcefully spinning him around and pressing him against the side of his own cruiser. They expertly disarmed him, stripping his service weapon from its holster and tossing it onto the hood of the car. "Hey, you can't do this! I am a sworn officer of the law!" Peterson yelled, though his voice cracked pathetically. Caldwell ignored him completely. He stepped toward the rear passenger door of the cruiser and looked through the glass. When he saw Major General David Henderson, a man who had saved Caldwell's life during a brutal ambush in Afghanistan 10 years prior, sitting in the back seat in a faded hoodie, handcuffed like a common criminal, a muscle in Caldwell's jaw twitched furiously. "Open this door," Caldwell commanded, without looking back. Jenkins practically sprinted over, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his keys twice before finally managing to unlock the rear door. David stepped out of the suffocating heat of the cruiser. He stood up straight, rolling his broad shoulders. He looked perfectly composed, though there were deep red indentations circling his wrists. "Sir," Caldwell said, his voice softening slightly as he executed a crisp salute. "At ease, Richard," David replied calmly, returning the salute despite his bound hands. "Sergeant, get those cuffs off the general immediately," Caldwell barked. An MP rushed forward with a universal key, and the heavy steel cuffs fell to the pavement with a sharp clatter. David brought his hands forward, slowly rubbing the circulation back into his wrists. Caldwell turned his attention back to Peterson, who was being held firmly against the car by the MPs. The 3-star general closed the distance until he was inches from Peterson's face. "Who gave you the authority to assault and kidnap a United States military commanding officer?" Caldwell demanded, his voice echoing across the silent highway. "He was prowling," Peterson stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "He was wearing a hoodie in a wealthy neighborhood. There were burglaries. I asked for ID and he refused. When I searched him, he had a fake DOD card." David stepped forward, his expression stone cold. "I did not refuse. I told you I lived at the residence you stopped me in front of. You confiscated my wallet, saw my driver's license, and when you saw my military ID, you declared it a fake without running it through your terminal. You didn't see an officer, Peterson. You saw a black man in a hoodie, and your prejudice made the decision for you." Caldwell's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He reached into Peterson's uniform pocket and extracted David's leather wallet. He flipped it open, pulling out the common access card. He held it up directly in front of Peterson's eyes. "Look at this card, officer," Caldwell whispered fiercely. "Look at the hologram. Look at the smart chip. Look at the 2 stars printed right next to the name of a man who has bled for this country more times than you have drawn breath. You didn't verify it because your ego and your bias blinded you to reality. At that moment, the wail of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of local backup. A single municipal police SUV skidded to a halt near the military perimeter. Out stepped Sergeant Michael O'Malley, the shift supervisor. O'Malley took one look at the heavily armed military convoy, the disarmed Peterson, and the two generals standing by the cruiser, and his face drained of color. "What in the hell is going on here?" O'Malley asked, jogging forward and keeping his hand strictly away from his belt. "Sergeant O'Malley, I presume?" Caldwell said, turning his piercing gaze to the supervisor. "Your officer here has just unlawfully detained Major General David Henderson under false pretenses, utilizing excessive force and ignoring valid federal identification." O'Malley looked at Peterson, horror dawning in his eyes. He had warned Peterson about his aggressive profiling tactics for years. Now the idiot had gone and arrested the Pentagon's newest regional commander. "General, I am profoundly sorry," O'Malley stammered, removing his hat. "I assure you, this is not how this department operates." "Save your apologies, Sergeant," David spoke up, his voice resonating with commanding clarity. "Officer Peterson has demonstrated a profound danger to the public he has sworn to protect. He operates on racial bias rather than legal procedure. He escalated a peaceful interaction into a physical assault because his authority was not blindly worshipped." David stepped closer to the terrified Peterson. The general didn't yell. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity of his words was heavier than any shout. "You thought you were putting me in my place this morning, officer," David said softly. "You thought the badge on your chest gave you the right to strip a man of his dignity simply because you didn't like the way he looked. But you chose the wrong man. And today, your career ends." The crisp morning air felt entirely different now, heavy with the suffocating weight of consequence. On the asphalt of Miller Highway, the flashing lights of the military convoy and local police cruisers painted a chaotic canvas. Officer Bradley Peterson stood frozen against the side of his vehicle, stripped of his service weapon and his pride. Sergeant Michael O'Malley did not hesitate. He had spent years watching Peterson walk the razor-thin line of departmental policy, knowing the man harbored deep-seated prejudices, but lacking the definitive proof needed to bypass the police union's formidable shielding. Now, the proof was standing right in front of him, flanked by 3-star military brass and a convoy of heavily armed federal troops. "Officer Peterson," O'Malley said, his voice stripped of any collegial warmth. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Peterson's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and terror. "Sarge, you can't be serious. You're going to arrest me. I made a mistake, okay? It was a misunderstanding. I thought he was a suspect from the Oak Ridge burglaries. You didn't make a mistake, Brad. You made a choice," O'Malley replied coldly, pulling his own pair of standard-issue steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You ignored protocol. You ignored valid federal identification, and you assaulted a citizen without probable cause. Turn around." Now, trembling violently, Peterson slowly turned around, placing his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly against the silent highway. The profound irony of the moment was not lost on anyone present. The exact same restraints Peterson had aggressively forced onto Major General David Henderson mere moments ago were now biting into his own wrists. "Brad Peterson, you are under arrest for false imprisonment, official misconduct, and assault under color of law," O'Malley recited the Miranda rights with a practiced mechanical rhythm, ensuring every word was captured by the dash cams of the surrounding vehicles. In the background, Lieutenant General Richard Caldwell turned to David. "Sir, my medical staff is on standby at the base. I strongly suggest we have you examined to document the abrasions on your wrists." "That won't be necessary, Richard," David said calmly, his gaze fixed on Peterson being loaded into the back of O'Malley's SUV. but I do want Major Gregory Cole from the JAG office dispatched to the municipal precinct immediately. I want a federal chain of custody established for the dash cam and body cam footage before anyone has a chance to experience a technical malfunction." "Consider it done," Caldwell nodded sharply, pulling a secure satellite phone from his vest. Meanwhile, Rookie Officer Kyle Jenkins was leaning against the hood of the military cruiser, his head buried in his hands. He was physically shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. O'Malley walked over to the young officer, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Jenkins," O'Malley said firmly, "look at me." Jenkins looked up, his face pale. "Sarge, I tried to stop him. I swear to God, I looked the general up on my phone. I showed Brad the press release. He just wouldn't listen. He slapped the phone out of my hand." "I know, kid. I heard you yelling when you got out of the car," O'Malley said, his tone softening slightly. "But right now, I need you to be a police officer. You are a material witness to a federal crime. I need your body cam, right now. Unplug it and hand it over." Jenkins immediately unclipped the small black camera from his chest rig and handed it to his sergeant. O'Malley placed it into an evidence bag, sealing it tightly. The drive back to the municipal precinct was a masterclass in psychological agony for Peterson. Sitting in the hard plastic back seat of the supervisor's SUV, the reality of his situation began to crush him. He was a 6-year veteran. He had a pension. He had a mortgage. In the span of 30 minutes, his entire life had unraveled because his ego refused to accept that a black man in a faded hoodie could own a $2 million home and command an entire military installation. When the convoy pulled into the precinct's secure underground Sally Port, the welcoming committee was already waiting. Chief of Police Arthur Pendleton, a stern, no-nonsense administrator who had been abruptly pulled from his Sunday morning coffee, stood with his arms crossed. Next to him stood 2 special agents from the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. O'Malley opened the rear door of the SUV and hauled Peterson out by his bicep. Peterson looked up at Chief Pendleton, searching desperately for a lifeline. "Chief, please," Peterson begged, his voice cracking pitifully. The Union cannot save you from the Department of Defense, Bradley," Chief Pendleton interrupted, his voice echoing in the concrete garage. "I just got off the phone with the Pentagon. You didn't just arrest a citizen. You detained the commander of the Joint Strategic Operations Center. The FBI is taking lead on this investigation regarding civil rights violations. You are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately." Peterson's knees buckled slightly, but O'Malley held him upright. "Process him," Pendleton ordered O'Malley, "and put him in holding cell 4, alone." As Peterson was marched toward the booking desk, the heavy steel doors of the holding cells looming ahead, he realized the inescapable truth. The badge that had shielded him from his own prejudice for 6 years had just been shattered against a wall of undeniable authority. The system he had weaponized was now turning its unforgiving machinery directly onto him. The interrogation room was uncomfortably cold, the stark fluorescent lights humming with a low, irritating buzz. Peterson sat at the metal table, stripped of his uniform shirt, wearing only a standard-issue grey undershirt. His wrists were free, but the phantom pressure of the handcuffs remained. Across the table sat Frank Donovan, the senior representative for the local police union. Donovan was sweating, continuously mopping his brow with a crumpled handkerchief. He had built his career protecting cops from disciplinary boards, employing a ruthless strategy of delaying tactics and technicalities. But today, Donovan looked like a man standing on the tracks watching a freight train approach. "Okay, Brad, listen to me," Donovan whispered, leaning forward. "We stick to the script. You had reasonable suspicion. The neighborhood had experienced burglaries. The suspect matched the general description of an adult male. He refused to identify himself properly. You used standard stabilization techniques. It was a good faith mistake. Before Peterson could nod, the heavy metal door clicked open. In walked Special Agent Robert Lang of the FBI, closely followed by Major Gregory Cole, a razor-sharp attorney from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Major Cole placed a thick, black briefcase on the table and opened it with 2 crisp snaps. "Good morning, gentlemen," Agent Lang said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He didn't offer a handshake. "Let's get right to it. Mr. Peterson, you are currently facing federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law. My client acted within the scope of his duties based on reasonable suspicion," Donovan interjected immediately, puffing out his chest. "General Henderson was uncooperative, and the identification provided was deemed suspicious in the heat of the moment. We are prepared to argue qualified immunity." Major Cole smiled, a terrifying, predatory smile. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, portable digital audio player. "Mr. Donovan," Major Cole said smoothly, his voice laced with absolute confidence. "Are you aware that General Henderson was on an active, open-line conference call with his Chief of Staff, Colonel Robert Davies, at the exact moment your client initiated the stop?" Peterson's stomach dropped into his shoes. The blood drained from Donovan's face. "No," Donovan whispered. "Yes," Major Cole continued, tapping the digital player. "General Henderson utilizes a highly sensitive, military-encrypted wireless earbud. When your client aggressively assaulted him, the earbud fell into the hood of the general's sweatshirt. It recorded the entire interaction, with crystal-clear audio, directly to the Department of Defense secure servers." Major Cole pressed the play button. The small speaker crackled to life, filling the interrogation room with Peterson's own voice. "Nobody jogs in a hoodie that beat up around here, kid. This is a gated-style community. He's casing the houses." "I don't need a description. I know what doesn't belong." Then came David's calm, authoritative voice, explaining his residence, followed by the sickening sound of the physical struggle, and Peterson's mocking dismissal of the military ID. "It's a fake, Kyle. Stop questioning me. He's a nobody, Jenkins. He's a thug who wandered into the wrong zip code." Major Cole stopped the recording. The silence in the room was deafening. "As you can hear," Agent Lang said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table, "there was no reasonable suspicion. There was no good faith mistake. Your client explicitly stated he did not need a suspect description because he, quote, knew what didn't belong. That establishes clear, undeniable racial bias and premeditation for a civil rights violation." Donovan slowly closed his notepad. He looked at Peterson, then looked at the federal agents. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. "I need to confer with Union leadership," Donovan said quietly, pushing his chair back. "Frank, you can't leave me here." Peterson panicked, grabbing the Union rep's sleeve. Donovan gently pried Peterson's fingers off his arm. "Brad, they have you on federal audio, admitting to profiling a 2-star general. I can't fight the Department of Defense and the DOJ at the same time. You're on your own." As the door clicked shut behind the Union rep, the final nail was driven into Peterson's coffin. Major Cole pulled a secondary stack of files from his briefcase. They were thick, manila folders, each one stamped with the police department's internal affairs seal. This incident gave the Department of Justice the probable cause necessary to subpoena your entire disciplinary jacket, Mr. Peterson, Agent Lang explained, tapping the stack of files. "We found 7 previous complaints of racial profiling, unlawful detention, and excessive force, all buried by your union, all dismissed by internal reviews. Because you picked the wrong target today, the DOJ is reopening every single one of these cases. You are not just going to prison for what you did to General Henderson. You are going to answer for every person you bullied when you thought nobody was watching." Peterson buried his face in his hands, a pathetic, sobbing gasp escaping his lips. The armor of his badge was gone. The protection of his union was gone. He was nothing but a broken man facing the crushing weight of his own karma. Across town, General David Henderson stood in his home office, looking out over the pristine, quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge Estates. His wrists still ached slightly, a physical reminder of the morning's ordeal. He had commanded troops in the most dangerous corners of the globe, fighting to protect the liberties of his country. Today, he had fought that same battle on his own front lawn. He had not used a weapon. He had used patience, intellect, and the uncompromising power of truth. The battle was won, and the streets were a little bit safer. The federal courthouse in downtown Charlotte was an imposing structure of polished granite and reinforced glass, a fitting arena for the final chapter of Bradley Peterson's downfall. 8 months had passed since the incident on Elmwood Drive. The brisk autumn winds whipped outside, but inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Peterson sat at the defense table, looking entirely diminished. Stripped of his badge, his uniform, and the aggressive bravado that had defined his adult life, he appeared remarkably small. He wore an ill-fitting grey suit that hung loosely on his frame, his face pale and deeply lined from months of sleepless nights in a pre-trial detention facility. His union had abandoned him, leaving him entirely in the hands of a court-appointed federal public defender who looked equally exhausted by the sheer weight of the evidence they were up against. Across the aisle, the prosecution table was anchored by Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Lawson, a formidable litigator who specialized in civil rights abuses under the color of law. But the true center of gravity in the room was the man sitting in the front row of the gallery. Major General David Henderson sat in perfect, motionless posture. Today there was no faded black hoodie. He wore his pristine Army Service uniform. The twin silver stars on his epaulettes gleamed under the recessed lighting, and the rows of colorful ribbons on his chest told a silent, undeniable story of ultimate sacrifice and unwavering loyalty to his nation. Lieutenant General Richard Caldwell sat to his immediate right, serving as a silent, imposing guardian of military solidarity. The trial had been swift and brutal for the defense. Rookie Officer Kyle Jenkins had taken the stand on the second day. Jenkins had voluntarily resigned from the local police force shortly after the incident, unwilling to serve in a department whose culture had bred men like his former training officer. Under oath, Jenkins recounted the morning with devastating clarity. He testified about Peterson's immediate, baseless assumption regarding the general's presence in the wealthy neighborhood. He detailed his own desperate attempts to show Peterson the Department of Defense press release, and how Peterson had violently swatted the phone away, choosing blind prejudice over documented fact. But the fatal blow had come when Prosecutor Lawson played the audio recording, captured by the general's military-grade earbud. When the audio filled the silent courtroom, Peterson had stared down at his trembling hands, unable to meet the eyes of the 12 jurors. Hearing his own voice, arrogant, mocking, and dripping with venomous bias, echo off the mahogany walls, stripped away any remaining illusion of a simple misunderstanding. The jurors' faces hardened. Several shook their heads in overt disgust. They heard a man who believed his badge was an absolute license to subjugate anyone he deemed beneath him. Now the jury was returning. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing sharply. Judge Arthur Reynolds, a stern federal jurist with decades of experience on the bench, took his seat and adjusted his spectacles. He looked down at the jury forewoman, a middle-aged school teacher who held a folded slip of paper. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Reynolds asked, his voice steady. "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman replied, her tone resolute. Peterson's public defender placed a steadying hand on his client's shoulder. Peterson squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing shallow and erratic. On the federal charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant, Bradley Peterson. Guilty, the forewoman read. On the charge of false imprisonment. Guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault by a peace officer. Guilty. A heavy, collective exhale swept through the gallery. Peterson slumped forward, burying his face in his hands as a soft, pathetic sob escaped his throat. There was no outrage, no shouting, only the absolute, crushing finality of a system correcting a profound error. Judge Reynolds did not wait for a separate sentencing hearing. The federal guidelines were clear, and the judge's patience with corrupt authority figures was non-existent. "Mr. Peterson, stand up," Judge Reynolds commanded. Peterson struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the wooden table for support. Law enforcement officers are entrusted with an extraordinary amount of power. They are given the authority to suspend a citizen's liberty in the pursuit of justice. Judge Reynolds began, his voice echoing with righteous authority. When that power is weaponized by prejudice, it does not just harm the victim. It fractures the very foundation of public trust. You looked at a decorated military commander, a man who has devoted his life to defending the freedoms you so casually abused, and you saw only a target for your own bigotry. Your actions were not a mistake. They were a manifestation of malice. The judge paused, letting the heavy words settle over the disgraced cop. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a period of 180 months, 15 years, without the possibility of early parole. You are further barred for life from holding any position of public trust or authority. The sound of the judge's gavel striking the sounding block cracked through the room like a gunshot. Federal marshals immediately flanked Peterson. They pulled his arms behind his back, the same aggressive, humiliating motion he had used on David months prior, and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. As he was marched down the center aisle toward the holding cells, Peterson locked eyes with General Henderson for a fleeting second. David did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply watched the disgraced man walk away with the calm, analytical gaze of a commander watching a neutralized threat removed from the battlefield. Justice had not just been served. It had been absolute. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun broke through the clouds. General David Henderson adjusted his service cap and walked down the wide granite steps alongside General Caldwell. He had not let the darkness of one prejudiced man infect his spirit. Instead, David used the incident as a catalyst, launching a joint task force between the military base and the local community to sponsor legal education and civil rights training for regional academies. He turned an act of hatred into a foundation for lasting change, proving once and for all that true authority requires no shouting, no violence, and no intimidation. True authority is forged in honor, tested in adversity, and defined by the quiet, unyielding power of integrity. Thank you for tuning in to this powerful story of justice, accountability, and the absolute reality of karma hitting back. True leadership and honor will always expose prejudice and corruption in the end. If you felt the satisfaction of seeing this power-tripping officer finally face the consequences of his actions, make sure to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends and family to spread the message that nobody is above the law. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell for more incredible real-life drama. Would you have stayed as calm as the general? Let us know in the comments below.